Hey everyone, welcome anatomy students to today's explainer. We're jumping right in today because we're looking at a biological journey you take, honestly, thousands of times a day, probably without even a second thought. We are tracing the incredible anatomical path of human communication. It's this completely fascinating sequence of events that turns a basic breath of air into the complex thoughts and emotions we share with the world. Let's get right to it. So, to kick things off, I want to pose a question that challenges a pretty common misconception. What's the actual difference between a laugh and a spoken word? Or, say, a baby crying versus an adult delivering a speech? We tend to lump all this together as simply making noise, but anatomically, they represent two completely distinct processes. Today, we're going to map that exact journey from innate vocalization all the way up to the incredibly complex learned mechanics of speech. Okay, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First up, voice versus speech. Second, the power of the diaphragm. Third, vocal folds and vibration. And finally, articulating sound into speech. Starting with section 1, voice versus speech, differentiating sound from language. Now, before we get into the heavy mechanics, we gotta nail down our base definitions. Voice, or vocalization, is just the basic sound produced using your lungs and larynx. It's totally innate. An infant crying, a toddler laughing, that's voice production. And actually, your basic voice is as unique as your fingerprint. Speech, on the other hand, is a whole different beast. Speech is learned. It takes a series of wildly complex movements that alter that basic tone into specific, identifiable sounds. It's literally how we express our thoughts orally to one another. So the big takeaway here? A baby cooing is voice, but forming understandable words, that's the learned mechanics of speech. Moving on to section 2, power of the diaphragm, the engine of breath. To really understand where a voice comes from, we have to travel all the way down to the bottom of the respiratory system. Meet the diaphragm. It's this large, dome-shaped muscle located right below your lungs. Look, before we can even think about talking or making a peep, we have to breathe. The diaphragm is the absolute anatomical anchor for human breathing. It's the foundation for literally everything that follows. Let's step through the actual mechanics of a single breath here. Step 1, your dome-shaped diaphragm contracts and expands vertically. Step 2, this action lifts the rib cage, which allows your lungs to physically expand and fill up with oxygen-rich air. Then, step 3, the diaphragm and the rib cage return to their resting positions. And as they settle back down, they force that air, now carrying carbon dioxide, right back out of the lungs. As anatomy students, what you really need to grasp here is that this exhalation, this basic forced air coming out of the lungs, is the crucial fuel for our eventual vocalization. Without this engine, well, there's no sound. All right, section 3, vocal folds and vibration, generating the sound. Let's shift our anatomical focus further up the body. As that air gets forced out of the lungs by the diaphragm, it travels up a tube called the trachea. The trachea is, well, think of it as the main highway that the air travels up whenever we exhale. So at the top of that highway, the air hits the larynx. You probably know it as the voice box, and it's the primary organ of voice production. Location-wise, it sits perfectly tucked between the base of the tongue and the top of the trachea. The larynx is absolutely vital because it houses two very crucial bands of tissue, the vocal folds, and they're positioned directly opposite of each other. Now, when you're just sitting there breathing and not speaking, these vocal folds, they just stay completely open. Which obviously brings us to the main event. If the folds are normally open for breathing, how do we actually produce a voice? Well, get ready because the high-speed physics happening inside the larynx in literally a fraction of a second are pretty mind-blowing. First, we need to define the exact space where this magic happens, the glottis. And the glottis isn't actually a structure itself. Rather, it's the opening between the vocal folds. Like I mentioned, it's wide open during normal breathing. But when it's time to generate voice, that opening narrows significantly. I want you to visualize the air from your lungs being tightly squeezed through this narrow little app. Okay, the step-by-step physics of this vibration are just incredible. When it's time to speak, step 1, airflow from the lungs causes pressure to increase dramatically just below the larynx. Step 2, this intense pressure actually blows the vocal folds apart. But specifically, they get forced apart at the bottom first, followed by the top. Step 3, the air from your lungs blows past these folds at extremely high speeds through that narrow glottis. And then step 4, this high-speed exhalation forces the air through so fast it creates a suction effect. This suction immediately yanks the vocal folds violently back together, again from bottom to top. This rapid blowing apart and sucking together creates a continuous vibration. To produce normal, loud speech, your vocal folds and larynx absolutely have to vibrate exactly like this. Which leads us to section 4, articulating sound into speech, shaping the final product. So that vibrating air is now moving out of the throat, making its way up into the mouth and the nasal cavity. We've successfully produced a basic buzzing tone with our vocal folds. But as we know from earlier, a basic tone isn't language. So we gotta pivot and ask, what exactly is speech? How do we get from a weird buzzing vibration to, a Shakespearean sonnet? Well, speech isn't just something happening inside your mouth. It is an intensely complicated, full-body, highly coordinated muscular effort. Producing understandable speech requires precisely coordinated muscle actions happening simultaneously across your head, your throat, your chest, mouth, nasal cavity, and even your abdomen. It's like a complete physiological symphony. And this brings us to the specific anatomical articulators. To create distinct speech sounds, different parts of our nose and mouth have to be carefully positioned. We manipulate our velum, our tongue, our jaw, and our lips. We move all of these flexible, fleshy parts in reference to the permanent, hard parts of our vocal tract, like the roof of the mouth. By rapidly flicking the tongue against the roof of the mouth or opening and closing the lips and jaw, we are literally chopping and shaping that vibrating column of air from the larynx into specific, recognizable words. Suddenly, it all kind of starts to make sense, right? Speech development is this gradual process that requires literally years of practice. You can totally see now why a baby can cry and vocalize the exact second they're born. The innate mechanics of the lungs and vocal folds are just ready to go. But it takes a child years to learn how to regulate and precisely position the jaw, tongue, lips, and velum to produce speech you can actually understand. It's a massive feat of muscular regulation. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought on our final slide today. Next time you casually walk past a friend and say a simple hello, ask yourself, how many muscles did you just perfectly coordinate across your chest, throat, and head in a fraction of a second? The journey from a simple contraction of the diaphragm to the high-speed vibration of the vocal folds, all the way up to the precise articulation of the lips and tongue, it is truly an everyday anatomical miracle. Keep that in mind as you continue your anatomy studies. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking questions about the amazing human body.